On today's episode of Tap Out Talk, we're going to get into the Broken Skull sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin. All that and more, and we're going to go over a good one. You're not going to want to miss it. Let's get in. Welcome to episode 1, The Undertaker, a new series here on Tap Out Talk. We're going to go over Stone Cold Steve Austin, Broken Skull sessions, and we're going to recap and review it. The main key here is I recap and review, and then you, based on that, decide if you want to invest an hour and about a half to actually watch the actual show. So I'll give you all the highlights. And then you can decide, if that's the best approach for you, or if this was enough information about what you need to get to know about this episode. So we're going to go ahead and start right in with the first guest that Stone Cold ever had on his podcast, which is the Undertaker, Part 1. And so let's go ahead and go over the first talking point. So the podcast actually starts out with talking a little bit about the Undertaker in his really getting his start in the wrestling business. And it was a little crazy just to kind of, hear some of the stories, because this is not really something I know a lot about the Undertaker, because my first experience really watching the Undertaker as a kid was in, the late 80s, early 90s, really, when he debuted in Survivor Series of 1990. And that was, actually this larger than life character. And I remember being a kid watching him and thinking, wow, this guy's really scary. And, I just, my friends and I talked about him all day the next day at school. So this segment that Stone Cold kind of takes him through talks about a tag team he was in called the Skyscrapers. And that was back in the NWA, National Wrestling Alliance. So the way he got into this was an injury was suffered to Sid Vicious, also known as Psycho Sid, later in his career. He opened up, it was the Taker's first real opportunity in the NWA, and he was brought in as Dan Spivey's new partner when that injury occurred. And the promotion was geared up to actually take on a program with the Road Warriors at Clash of Champions 10. And that's when things got real. Dan Spivey, who wasn't happy with the match build, grabbed a chair and actually beat the crap out of Hawk and Animal. Backstage, the future Deadman sat on the edge of a seat in the locker room, expecting his opponents to come throw hands with him. And as he was kind of preparing for that, he was totally shocked when Hawk and Animal strolled in and shook Spivey's hand and thanked him for getting them some heat, and looked at Taker and said, "Well done for someone who was so green too." And then when Dan left, or when the Road Warriors left, Dan looked over and winked at his young partner, The Undertaker. And that's when The Undertaker realized that, Spivey was a respected tough guy in the industry, and not even hard-nosed brawlers like the Road Warriors were willing to mess with him. So this was an interesting little start to a great career. And it was interesting to think that he got his career start off of being brought in to fill a spot in a tag team for a guy that got injured. So actually, it was Psycho Sid in that spot for many years, and they needed another big man just to plug and play. So it was interesting to hear The Undertaker being so green in the industry. Like I said, because I did not know him until he really got into his work with the WWF at the time, which is going to actually go into our next segment. And that is meeting Vince McMahon. Have you ever wondered what it's like to meet Vince McMahon? You ever wondered what that initial interview is like when you actually get to know him as a talent? Well, in 1990, Taker, who wasn't quite called The Undertaker obviously yet, met with Vince McMahon. And at this point, he was just Mark Callaway. And it was the first time he found himself in the receiving end of some tough questions in Vince's office. So McMahon asked his potential new hire if he had any hidden talents, and it turned out he did. And Austin kind of pointed out here at this point in the podcast that he said that Vince likes to interview guys when he first comes into the company and find out what they do. And what a lot of the talent doesn't know is when Vince does this, he's like, what do you like to do in your personal life? And then he likes to create a wrestling character off of that because he feels like it's the real version of them. And unfortunately, some guys over the years have said, well, I'm a plumber. And I used to work at as a trash man for a trash company. And that's how you end up getting those kind of characters. So Austin kind of made it known and asked Taker what he was asked. And Taker said, well, he had a special talent of singing a little bit in the shower. And as soon as he said it, he regretted saying those words when he left his mouth because, this is a first-time employer. And it was definitely, a little bit of regret on Taker's end. And there's a funny moment during this interview where the Undertaker shoots that he honestly was a little worried that he might become something like Shower Boy. And he knew he was entering a different kind of world with the WWF. And he also knew that McMahon had a penchant for creating over-the-top cartoonish characters. And maybe he should have just kept his mouth shut. So in a good reason, in a good way, Vince actually did not see his new wrestler as a wrestling version of Frank Sinatra. He didn't view The Undertaker as that. And so he had something else in mind. And he first referred to Taker as The Undertaker when he actually called him up to offer him a full-time gig, and it wasn't meant to be Shower Boy. So he actually retells the story. He says that Vince actually calls him up, and he goes, he didn't recognize the number. And Taker said that he didn't recognize the number, and so he answered, and right there's Vince McMahon, and hi, am I talking to The Undertaker? Is this The Undertaker? And Mark Callaway, Undertaker, at the time was like, had no idea how to answer that phone call because he just come right out the gate with it. And he asked if he was being talking to The Undertaker. And so he looked to make sure it wasn't a joke, and he was like, yeah, this is The Undertaker. And from there, Vince liked that answer, and he took that pitch and gave it to Mark Callaway, and the rest is history. And he debuted it. He wasn't quite sure what he had in mind. At this point in the podcast, they were able to show some photos of some early sketches of what this character would, look like. And it was more of an old Western Undertaker, that was basically waiting for the Cowboys to shoot it out. So that was a little bit about how he met Vince, and at least he wasn't singing in the shower. Instead, it was marching to a funeral march tune. So, which leaves us to his debut. Now, remember, Undertaker didn't know exactly how he was going to debut. And so there was a lot of fear around it. It was Survivor Series 1990. And The Undertaker, he also kind of mentioned during this, and he had a little bit of fear because in the debut at Survivor Series, he knew they'd been hyping up this what's going to hatch from the egg bit. And it was at Survivor Series, and there was this big egg, and something was going to hatch out of the egg at Survivor Series on the pay-per-view. And they haven't told The Undertaker the plans yet for that. And The Undertaker just said, oh, man, I hope I don't have to pop out of this egg. So, it's kind of funny to hear Taker tell these stories and to realize that he was basically worried about being Shower Boy and now worried about being the Gobbledygooker, which we learned it was that later on. So during the Survivor Series, he actually, rest assured, when he debuted his match, and The Undertaker hurled Dusty Rhodes over the top rope, working a few basic spots on him. Inside, the Taker's heart, he said his heart was beating through his chest, and because he grew up idolizing Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream. And so working with Dusty almost ended the gig before it really started. And Taker admitted he found it seriously difficult to smile when Rhodes was sailing over the ropes. And he'd come a long way from meeting in WCW with Ole Anderson, during which, the booker told him, and we got to a point in this conversation where Ole Anderson in WCW told The Undertaker he would never amount to anything in the business. He would never, amount to a dime. There was a real good moment between him and Austin here, because if you remember, Austin was told a similar thing by Eric Bischoff, and they said, "There's no way I can market you with your black boots and your black trunks. You're just kind of too boring." So you could tell both of these, I'm going to say Hall of Fame legends. Even the Taker's not in the Hall of Fame yet, but future Hall of Fame legends. They both, shared that kind of moment where guys told them, and how many times, have people been told in their career, well, you're never going to end up being good at this. And they persevere through that and prove their doubters wrong. So always remember out there, if you have haters, they're just fans in denial. Okay. That combined with the Taker, and not hatching from the egg. And, after the match with Dusty, the Taker went into the locker room and made sure to thank him for, being so giving to a new guy on the roster. And perhaps Rhodes could see that Ole could what Ole couldn't, but it was mind blowing to think that Anderson said something so harsh to one of wrestling's greatest wrestlers. So definitely, a good story here. And, I like the fact that he felt like he kind of arrived in his first match ever in the WWF by feeling that, Dusty Rhodes kind of helping work with him and getting to work with such a legend at so early in his career. So, which kind of leads into him becoming The Undertaker. And to become The Undertaker, it was a challenge. He was actually first introduced by the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, and that was his first manager. Actually, he was hired in by DiBiase to be The Undertaker for the Survivor Series, and then he was passed off to Brother Love, who was his initial manager for the longest time. At that point, the Taker admits in this conversation, he said it took him almost a full year to acclimate to his new character. He became accustomed to showing off his superior athletic ability in WCW, and he loved hitting the ropes, and he loved performing leapfrogs and being so flexible. And the Undertaker gimmick restricted him to being slow and methodical movements, and it was a change that he had to focus and antagonizing with so for the long time. He said it took him almost a year to get used to these slow stalking type movements, and being impervious to pain and that kind of thing. So he had to learn not to sell moves, and he had to learn to, just be a lot slower in his approach. Taker had to fight his natural instincts, so he watched others fly around the ring bumping their asses off, and he knew he couldn't do that. So the only problem was that he also believed that his new persona would fizzle out as too much soon. So he pulled back a bit and put his ego aside and lengthened the Taker's shelf life. It was a smart decision, and he'd come to thank himself for years. Instead of bumping around others, he cleverly showcased his athleticism by using in-character moves like the diving clothesline off the top rope or the big jumping DDT that he mastered, right? So he started using some of those skill sets, but in a slower fashion. And I really believe when The Undertaker then went on and got Paul Bearer as his manager, who was a indie manager and was very known in other territories, these two were a perfect match made in heaven or hell. And Paul Bearer, I believe, really helped take The Undertaker to the next level and acted as a really good complimentary mouthpiece that would help him with the interviews, and so that it wouldn't, take away too much from, him trying to work on getting better in the ring because he was so young. And it's interesting how the WrestleMania streak came about because, he first took on Jimmy Snuka and beat a Hall of Famer, and then he kind of went on for years. And I don't think the plan was to have him, have such a long streak. They just had to protect this Undertaker character from losing. And next thing you know, the streak just kind of happened. So it was a good little segment talking about how he had to become The Undertaker from the gimmick, from the fear of overcoming the gimmick. Because let's be real, if you gave this gimmick to anybody else with less talent than Mark Callaway, it probably wouldn't work out as well. My guys might remember they tried to do a good version of The Undertaker many years ago with, I believe it was Kevin Thorne, and they called him Mordecai, and it just kind of fizzled out. Next, we get a little bit of a fun story in the interview, and The Undertaker tells Austin about a time with the rock group Cypress Hill. And by his own admission, The Undertaker was a bit of a party animal back in the day. And that led to one of the most prestigious stories among his WWF peers in the 90s. So they were in the middle of a 17-day European tour overseas. The Undertaker told some friends he was going to take a night off from drinking and hit the sack a little early. Well, first he decided to pop into a hotel bar to say hello to everyone, and an innocent decision that would lead to one of the most memorable evenings of his life. Cypress Hill was in there hanging out with the roster, and one of them made the mistake of calling the Undertaker out when he went to leave, and he told Austin he decided to show them a thing or two, and he actually ended up putting one of the band members to bed in the wee hours of the following morning. So, he was all ready to kind of relax, and they were basically kind of was like, oh, I thought you were kind of a party man. And so, they kind of called out his man card a little bit. And at that point, they went back and they partied all to the crazy hours of the morning. And X-Pac was actually there too, sleeping on Taker's shoulder in the band's hotel suite. And the Undertaker was the last man standing, and even managed to no-sell how hungover he was for the next few hours later in the hotel lobby before boarding the bus. So we're just going to say this little match, he's undefeated in the this matchup in the series. So Taker 1, Cypress Hill 0. Up next, we talk a little bit about how the Undertaker possibly was supposed to go to WCW Nitro during the midst of the Monday Night Wars with WWF. And there's been a lot of talk over the years why the Undertaker never left the WWF to rejoin WCW. At this time, they were throwing so much money at talents, and they got guys like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and even Hulk Hogan to go over there and revitalize that brand. So some claim that he almost did before becoming his biker character in 2000. Kevin Nash kind of tells a story in a different interview where he said that the whole biker gimmick was preparing him for ditching the Undertaker character to leave the WCW to see if he could still make something else work. Eric Bischoff actually also stated this and confirmed it on his podcast as well, and that he wouldn't have known what to do with Mark Callaway if the Taker gimmick, wasn't allowed to move with him, which it would have been copyrighted by WWF. So the Broken Skull session here actually cleared everything up. Taker couldn't forget what Ole Anderson actually said to him in the late 80s, and that he never stopped thanking Vince for being the one guy that actually gave him a chance. And so, I think it's kind of important. Taker's a loyal guy. And even though there was probably big money being thrown at him, he said he told McMahon in the mid-90s that he'd go down with the ship if it came to that. And there was no way in hell that he was leaving for WCW, even when they were booting the WWF's ass in the ratings. And this kind of loyalty is admirable. But Taker was also keen on to stress where he was aware of how much money that he could have made back then. But still, he ended up receiving pay slips for one-off matches that made for all the lean for the new generation on the back end. So basically, it was a risky move for him to kind of, leave this dead man gimmick, right? But he did go on to become WWE champion, and he then went on to do the American Badass gimmick, which kind of did get him eased into the Attitude Era along with Stone Cold Steve Austin and a lot of other guys. So speaking of the American Badass gimmick, we went from the dead man, and you could see the WWF like slowly, showing the Undertaker on a motorcycle. So you have the dead man on a motorcycle, and then they were easing us into the American Badass gimmick. So even though turning the Undertaker into a realistic biker idea was the Undertaker's idea, it was one that he actually kind of found terrifying. And then this part of the podcast, Stone Cold actually plays some footage with a reintroduction of the Undertaker at Judgment Day 2000, when Stone Cold Steve Austin basically said that he was mega nervous before entering the ring, and he was opening up for the first time and giving fans a look into the real man behind the supernatural Undertaker character. So he was very nervous, but he knew he had to get along with the corporate. He had to go along with the corporate Attitude Era that they wanted to go with. So that, if it was poorly received, also he knew that it would destroy almost a decade of hard work that he did and ruin him as a wrestler. So becoming the American Badass wasn't simply a case of chewing tobacco and cutting promos and wearing denim shirts. It was metaphoric change that could easily have been shattered the years of dedication to a character that people adored. Taker knew that, so he wasn't going to really, in his words, fuck around with it being a half-baked, tweak. He wanted to meet the challenge head on and evolve the gimmick to extend his career, because he knew his career would die in the Attitude Era. So, and it worked, and it slowly but surely created anticipation and actually made fans want the Deadman character to come back, in which they were able to actually go back to the Deadman character after being the American Badass and the Attitude Era died down. So this was fascinating to hear, the Undertaker talk about this himself in this interview. And I really enjoyed hearing, kind of clearing up the rumors about WCW. And because I'm sure back then they were throwing lots of money at him. But, again, that was Vince's prize guy, and he was 100% loyal. And I think this proves why he's such a locker room leader to a lot of the younger guys for years to come. And not only that, but he was able to take a possibly impossible gimmick to get over and actually make it work, and then adjust to the Attitude Era and become the American Badass, and then adjust back after that. So kudos to the Undertaker. And I mean, this story I enjoyed, and it really made us realize why he is such a legend in this business, and there probably will never be another guy like him. Up next, they talked a little bit about retiring and what would be the Undertaker's retirement match. We are then shown, and this was at WrestleMania 28, we were then shown a classic image of Taker and Shawn Michaels. So this actually happened at the Taker, Shawn Michaels, Triple H Hell in a Cell match. And the stage really wasn't pre-planned. And according to the Undertaker, the way this match ended with this iconic, at the top of the stage, them all kind of riding off in the sunset together, it happened organically. And there was a genuine tear running down his cheek because he really did believe that was a wrap of an epic career. The Undertaker recalls thinking that he retired following that year and that he had nothing left to prove after the 4 storming back-to-back matches with Michaels and Triple H. And later that night, he remembers the pain searing through his body and the adrenaline wore off, and that cemented in the Taker's mind that he would have to embrace the reality of the situation and hang up the boots for good. But Vince McMahon, it's always Vince McMahon. And, he convinced The Undertaker to have one more match, one more run. And of course, that turned into another run and another run and yet another. And he's still operating in that mindset that every match could be his last. And, as of this point, The Undertaker, as of this year in 2021, did say, oh, well, I'm retired now, officially. And, you just got to wonder in the back of your head, will he get the itch? But I do think he'll end up staying retired at this point. We then go into a little bit of talk about the streak. So the streak started, like I said, when he began his WrestleMania streak against Jimmy Snuka. And over the years, he's fought every legend and has been undefeated against them, from Ric Flair to Shawn Michaels to Triple H to Batista. I mean, you name them all, and The Undertaker has beat them at WrestleMania. And this was at WrestleMania 30, and The Undertaker was taking on Brock Lesnar, who was a dominant beast in the industry already for years. And it was one of those, he was coming off the feud. And then, I remember seeing this match myself live, and I remember being shocked. And I actually thought they messed up. I thought the referee messed up the count, or I thought they didn't, I was like, there's no way they could have just made The Undertaker lose his streak to Brock Lesnar. And, you had to read that, subheading again. But when it came down to it, The Undertaker was out flat cold at the hands of Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 30. Crazy, kind of a sad note about this is The Undertaker doesn't remember even having that match, and he was very out of it post-match WrestleMania 30. He got concussed a few minutes into the brawl with Brock Lesnar, something he refuses to blame Brock for to this day. And he can't recall anything else about what happened. His last memory from that day is actually chatting with his wife, Michelle McCool, in the dressing room around 3:30 to 4 p.m. that afternoon. And things get hazy when he tries to think about prepping for the match, the bout itself, and what went down and when he returned from the curtain. Taker's memory picks up again when he was laying in the hospital bed at 4 or 5 a.m. the next morning. The concussion basically screwed up his confidence going forward, and he was still unable to pick out exactly when he got concussed in the match. But he can see himself wobbling a little bit after a few minutes, and then when rewatching and he thinks it might have happened when he took one of Brock's many superplexes. And so it's a kind of a sad story to tell you how real this industry gets. And, I like the term, when people say wrestling's fake, I hate hearing that. I think we all hate hearing that as fans because it doesn't mean these guys aren't athletes. I like the term predetermined. Chris Jericho, I heard him say that years ago. And yes, wrestling is predetermined, but, these guys are athletes and injuries do happen. And so this is would have been a bad note for The Undertaker's career to end on. And I look at this, and I remember being shocked. He was 21-1 after that. And it just blew my mind. And I was in disbelief probably for the whole night of WrestleMania 30, despite, having a great main event with Daniel Bryan. But I just was shocked about the Undertaker story. There was only a couple people that knew the streak was going to end. That was Taker, Lesnar, and Vince. The ref didn't know. The referee even goes on to tell that he was kind of shocked, and he did the count, but he was a little bit scared that he was going to lose his job. So it's interesting to see Taker not being able to remember this, and I know he didn't want to go out of the business like that. So that's why he had a couple more matches. So then we wrap up the session with Stone Cold, and they share a couple drinks and a few more stories. And they wanted to end on a high note, not just talk about the streak. So they actually shared a really fun clip and story of a time when Vince McMahon tried to get The Undertaker to do a Booker T spin-a-rooney in the middle of the ring. And they called it a take-a-rooney, right? And Undertaker was like, I'm not doing that. And then Vince even proceeds to come out to the ring and tries to force him to do it. And they show a clip of Vince McMahon doing a spin-a-rooney, and it's horrible. Looks like he's about to break his neck trying to do it. But him and Stone Cold have a good laugh over that. And then Stone Cold, also wanted to apologize to him for almost tearing off his ear in a match at Insurrection one year overseas at a pay-per-view where he just kind of hit him and sat on his head on the rope. And Undertaker said, you never have to apologize for it. And he goes, especially after the paycheck, that we got for that. So these guys ended on a really good note with this podcast. And this was a great podcast just to start out the Stone Cold Broken Skull sessions. And I feel like this was a really great way to just kind of break up the monotony of it. And you can tell behind the scenes a little bit of, an interview we wouldn't typically get with The Undertaker. So, guys, that's everything for today. I want to say thank you for joining me in this. If you feel like you want to watch the Stone Cold sessions, they are on Peacock and WWE Network. Remember, now it's not goodbye. It's see you later and game over.